So, welcome. I am really excited to read from the book How the Irish Saved Civilization. Just before I begin, the Irish and the Byzantine were the reasons why we know about many things. Like, for example, the Greeks, philosophers, I believe, were saved by the Byzantine as scribes, and the Irish saved other things, and we're going to read it. It's one of my favorite stories. I love ancient history, and there's something to be said about Tom Cahill's work. The untold story of Ireland's heroic role from the fall of Rome to the rise of medieval Europe. The word Irish is seldom coupled with the word civilization. When we think of peoples as civilized or civilizing, the Egyptians and the Greeks, the Italians and the French, the Chinese and the Jews may all come to mind. The Irish are wild, feckless, and charming, or morose, repressed, and corrupt, but not specially civilized. If we strain to think of Irish civilization, no image appears, no fertile crescent or Hindus Valley, no brooding bust of Beethoven. The simplest Greek auto-mechanic will name his establishment Parthenon, thus linking himself to an imagined ancestral culture. A semi-literate restaurateur of Sicilian origin will give pride of place to his plastered copy of Michelangelo's David, and so assert his presumed Renaissance ties. But an Irish businessman is far more likely to name his concern the Breffnet Bar or Kelly's Mowers, and announcing a merely local or personal connection unburdened by the resonance of history or civilization. And yet, Ireland, a little island at the edge of Europe that has known neither Renaissance nor Enlightenment, in some ways a third world country with, as John Beshman claimed, a Stone Age culture, had one moment of unblemished glory. For as the Roman Empire fell, as all through Europe matted and unwashed barbarians descended on the Roman cities, looting artifacts and burning books, the Irish, who were just learning to read and write, took up the great labor of copying all of Western literature, everything they could lay their hands on. These scribes then served as conduits through which the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian cultures were transmitted to the tribes of Europe, newly settled amid the rubble and ruined vineyards of the civilization they had overwhelmed. Without this service of the scribes, everything that happened subsequently would have been unthinkable. Without the mission of the Irish monks who single-handedly refounded European civilization throughout the continent in the bays and valleys of their exile, the world that came after them would have been an entirely different one, a world without books, and our own world would never have come to be. Not for 1,000 years, not since the Spartan legions had perished at the hot gates of Thermopylae, had Western civilization been put to such a test or faced such odds. Nor would it again face instinctions till in this century it devised the means of extinguishing all life. As our story opens at the beginning of the 5th century, no one could foresee the coming collapse. But to reasonable men, in the second half of the century, surveying the situation of their time, the end was no longer in doubt. Their world was finished. One could do nothing but, like Ausenius, retire to one's villa, write poetry, and await the inevitable. It never occurred to them that the building blocks of their new world would be saved by outlandish oddities from a land so marginal that the Romans had not bothered to conquer it, by men so strange they lived in little huts on rocky outcrops and shaved half their heads and tortured themselves with fasts and chills and nettle baths. As Kenneth Clark said, looking back from the great civilization of 12th century France or 17th century Rome, it is hard to believe that for quite a long time, almost 100 years, Western Christianity survived by clinging to places like Skellig Michael, a pinnacle of rock 18 miles from the Irish coast, rising 700 feet out of the sea. Clark, who began his civilization with a chapter called the skin of our teeth on the precarious transition from classical to medieval is an exception in that he gives full weight to the Irish contribution. Many historians fail to mention it entirely, and a few advert to the breathtaking drama of this culture cliffhanging. This is probably because it is easiest to describe status, classical than medieval, than movement, classical to medieval. It is also true that historians are generally experts in one period or the other, so that analysis of the transition falls outside everyone's competence. At all events, I know of no one single book now in print that is devoted to the subject of the transition, not even one in which this subject plays a substantial part. In looking to remedy this omission, we may as well ask ourselves the big question: how real is history? Is it just an enormous soup so full of disparate ingredients that it is uncharacterizable? Anyway, it is true, as Emil Cirion has remarked, that history proves nothing because it contains everything. Is not the reverse side of this that history can be made to say whatever we wish it to? I think, rather, that every age writes history anew, reviewing deeds and texts of other ages from its own vantage point. Our history, the history we read in school and refer to in later life, was largely written by Protestant Englishmen and Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans. Just as certain contemporary historians have been discovering that such redactors are not always reliable when it comes to the contribution of, say, women or African Americans. We should not be surprised to find that such storytellers have overlooked a tremendous contribution in the distant past that was both Celtic and Catholic, a contribution without which European civilization would have been impossible. To an educated Englishman of the last century, for instance, the Irish were, by their own very nature, incapable of civilization. The Irish, proclaimed Benjamin Disraeli, Queen Victoria's beloved prime minister, hate our order, our civilization, our enterprise, our industry, our pure religion. Disraeli's father had abandoned Judaism for the Church of England. This wild, reckless, indolent, uncertain, and superstitious race have no sympathy for the English character. Their ideal of human felicity is an alteration of clannish broils and coarse idolatry, i.e. Catholicism. Their history describes an unbroken circle of bigotry and blood. The venomous racism and knuckle-headed prejudice of this characterization may be evident to us, but in the day of dear old Dizzy, as the Queen called the man who had presented her with India, it simply passed for indisputable truth. Occasionally, of course, even the smug colonialist of the little Queen's empire would experience a momentary qualm. Could the conquerors possibly be responsible for the state of the colonialized? But they quickly suppress any doubt and wrap themselves in their own imperious superiority, as in this response by the historian Charles Kingsley to the famine-induced destitution he witnessed in Victorian Ireland. I am daunted by the human chimpanzees I saw along that hundreds of miles of horrible country. I don't believe there are fault, emphasis mine. I believe that there are not only many more of them that of old, but they are happier, better, and more comfortable fed and lodged under our rule than they were ever. But to see white chimpanzees is dreadful. If they were black, one would not feel it so much, but their skins, except where tanned by exposure, are as white as ours. Racism is a bitch, isn't it? Racism is a bitch. Let's continue. Nor can we comfort ourselves that such thinking passed long ago from the scene, as the distinguished Princeton historian Anthony Grafton wrote recently in the New York Review of Books of History Department at the Better American University. Catholic culture, like most Catholics, was usually disdained as the province of lesser breeds fit only for the legendary parochial schools where nuns told their charges never to order ravioli on a date lest their boyfriends be reminded of pillows. Stereotypes and prejudices of this kind, as nasty as any fastened upon Jews, persisted in American universities until an uncomfortable recent date. This book was published in 1995. That date may be only the day before yesterday, yet this not to accuse any historian of deliberate falsification. No, the problem is more subtle than deception, and artfully described by John Henry Newman in his fable of the man and the lion. The man once invited the lion to be his guest, and received him with princely hospitality. The lion had the run of a magnificent palace in which there were a vast many things to admire. There were large salons and long corridors, richly furnished and decorated, and filled with a profusion of fine specimens of sculptures and paintings, the works of the first masters in either art. The subjects represented were various, but the most prominent of them had an especial interest for the noble animal who stalked by them. It was that of the lion himself, and as the owner of the mansion led him from one apartment to another, he did not fail to direct his attention to the indirect homage which these various groups and tableaus paid to the importance of the lion tribe. There was, however, one remarkable feature in all of them, to which the host, silent as he was from politeness, seemed not at all insensible. That diverse as were they, these representation, in one point they all agreed that the man was always victorious and the lion was always overcome. It is not that the lion has been excluded from the history of art, but rather that he has been presented badly. He never wins. When the lion had finished his tour of the mansion, continues Newman, his entertainer asked him what he thought of the splendors it contained, and he in reply did full justice to the riches of its owner and the skill of its decorators, and he added, lions would have fared better had lions been the artists. Did you hear that? Lions would have fared better had the lions been the artists. History has been written by colonialists, and has decided to eradicate the contributions of African Americans, of Africans, of Asians, of the Hispanics, and other cultures I can't mention here. The list is long. The list is quite long. Let's continue. In the course of this history, we shall meet many entertainers, persons of substance, who have their story to tell, some of whom may believe that their story is all there is to tell. We shall be gracious and give them a hearing without disparagement. We shall even attempt to see things from their point of view. But every once in a while we shall find ourselves entertaining lions, at which moments it will be every reader for himself. We begin, however, not in the land of lions, but in the orderly, predictable world of Rome. For in order for us to appreciate the significance of the Irish contributors, we need to first take an inventory of the civilized empire of the late antiquity, the end of the world, how Rome fell, and why. Before I begin that chapter, right now, America is Rome. Let's begin. On the last cold day of December, in the dying year we count as 405, the river Rhine froze solid, providing the natural bridge that hundreds of thousands of hungry men, women, and children had been waiting for. They were the Barbari to the Romans, an indistinguished matted mass of others, not terrifying, just troublemakers, annoyances, things one would rather not have to deal with, non-Romans. To themselves they were presumably something more, but at the illiterate leave few records, we can only surmise their opinion of themselves. Did you hear that? We have no idea who these people were, because how they were portrayed was by the Romans as a mass of troublemakers, greasy, filthy savages. Neither the well-disciplined Roman soldiers ranked along the West Bank nor the anxious helter-skelter tribes amassing on the East Bank could have been giving much thought to their place in history. But this moment of slack, this relative calm before the pandemonium to follow, gives us the chance to study the actors on both sides of this river and to look backwards on what has been and forward to what will be. Ascending heavenward like the Roman eagle, we can view the Rhine, widest river in Europe, rising out of Lake Constance in the northern Alps, bending and bowing north and then northwest till after 820 miles of travel it reaches the coast of continental Europe and empties into the North Sea just opposite of the Thames estuary. Returning to our alpine heights, we can spot another river rising from a smaller lake just north of Constance and coursing east for more than twice the length of the Rhine till it spends itself in the Black Sea. This is the Danube, Europe's longest river after the Volga. To the north and east of these two alpine rivers live the barbarians. To the south and west lies Romagna, in its time the vastest and most powerful empire in human history. The omnipotence and immensity of this empire, embracing as it did the whole of the civilized world, are not the qualities that would strike us were we to soar above the Mediterranean on that fateful day. What we would discern is the very opposite of power, fragility, specifically geographic fragility. We live around a sea. The precipitous, Socrates had reminded his listeners, like frogs around a pond. For all the splendor of Roman standard, the power of Roman boot, and the extent of Roman road, the empire hugs the Mediterranean like a child's village of sand, waiting to be swept into the sea. From fruitful Gaul and Britain in the north to the fertile Nile Valley in the south, from the rocky Iberian shore in the west to the parched coast of Asia Minor, all provinces of the empire turned towards the Great Sea, towards Mediterranea, the Sea of Middle Earth. And as they turned to the center of their world, they turned their back on all that lies behind them beyond the Roman wall. They turned their backs on the barbarians. That Rome should ever fall was unthinkable to Romans. Its foundation was unassailable, sturdily sunk in a storied past, and steadily built on for 11 centuries and more. There was, of course, the prophecy. Someone in his cups, could always be counted on to bring that all saw the prophecy of the 12 eagles. Each eagle represented a century, leaving us with stubby fingers counting out the decades in a puddle of wine. Only 70 years remaining, give or take a decade. Predictably, laughter at the silliness of the whole idea, but in 70 years exactly, the empire would be gone. Eternal Rome, 11 centuries old, hardly foresaw its doom. But theories about its fall are very old indeed. 24 years after this Roman barbarian encounter along the Rhine, Augustine of Hippo, second city of Roman Africa, will be lying on his deathbed, listening to the clamor of another wave of barbarians as they attack the walls of his city. He has barely finished the final pages of his great defense of Christianity, the city of God, written to contradict the Roman pagans who discerned behind the barbarians' assault the old gods of Rome, angry at being forsaken by Christian converts. No, insists Augustine eloquently, it is not Christianity, but vice, uncumbered paganism that is bringing the empire down. 9 centuries later, as impressive feats of Rome, engineering, and sculpture are being dug up all over Italy at the dawn of the Renaissance, the question of what became of the cultural giants who built these things will be on everyone's lips. Petrarch, the Tuscan poet and scholar who is rightly remembered as the father of Renaissance humanism, rediscovers the concept of a fall, which following Augustine's lead, he blames on the empire's internal faults. Deviancy. It wasn't paganism, it was deviancy. And if you want to understand the fall of Rome, I would highly recommend you watch the series from the 1970s called I, Claudius. I, Claudius. Machiavelli, writing a century and a half later in a less spiritual, more cynical time, will blame the barbarians. When the first volume of Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire appeared in 1776. Wow. It raised far more lively interest in London than the news from the troublesome colonies in North America. The decline of Rome, wrote Gibbons, was a natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. I would add arrogant greatness. We are the greatest. We are Romans. What does that sound like? Arrogance is not wisdom, and wisdom has more power. It is lasting. Such a perception fit well with the cool and rational temper of the time. But as the more conventional English gentlemen of the late 18th century continued to turn the pages of Mr. Gibbon's discord, their blood began to boil. As the happiness of a future life is the great object of religion, he continued, we may hear without surprise or scandal that the introduction, or at least the abuse of Christianity, had some influence on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The clergy successfully preached the doctrines of patience and pusillanimity. The active virtues of society were discouraged, and the last remnants of the military spirit were buried in the cloister. A large portion of public and private wealth was consecrated to the specious demands of charity and devotion, and the soldiers' pay was lavished on the useless multitude of both sexes who could only plead the merits of abstinence and chastity. Interesting. Shock was registered and rebuttal issued, and Mr. Gibbons hastened to defend himself in his vindication, but in truth, his theory was no novelty, being scarcely distinguishable from the pagan theory Augustine had taken up in the Cultures against more than 13 centuries earlier. Nor was it devoid of merit. Still, it is helpful to know a little of Gibbon's own history. At 16, at an intense convert to Catholicism, packed off to Switzerland by his outraged father, where he was reconverted to Protestantism. This time, they were also called Huguenots. This time of the Calvinist variety, and almost simultaneously to the uncompromising skepticism of Voltaire, whom he met. The permanent effect on the mature man of so many and contrary youthful passions may easily be guessed. These earlier interpreters, first to pagan critics of Christianity, then to Augustine, Petrarch, Machiavelli, and Gibbon, have defined the limits of all later interpretation. Rome fell because of inner weakness, either social or spiritual, or Rome fell because of outward pressure, the barbarian hordes. What we can say with confidence is that Rome fell gradually, and that Romans for many decades scarcely noticed what was happening. Clues to the character of the Roman blindness are present in the scene along the frozen Rhine. The legionnaires on the Roman bank know that they have the upper hand and that they will always have. Even though some are only half civilized, recruits recently settle on the side of the river. They are now Romans, inheritors of nearly 12 centuries of civilization, husbandry, agriculture, viniculture, horticulture, cuisine, arts, literature, philosophy, law, politics, martial prowess, and all the gear and tackle and trim that goes with these pursuits. The world had never known anything as deep, as lasting, or as extensive as Pax Romana, the peace and predictability of Roman civilization. Inspecting the Roman soldiers now, we note the quiet authority of their presence, the polish of their person, the appropriateness of their stance. They are spiffy. More than this, there is an aesthetic to each gesture, an accoutrement. All details have been considered, all ogium, as they would say, to the fingertip, as a sculpture tests the smoothness and perfection of this finished marble. Their hair is cut with a thought to the shape of the head. They are clean shaven to show off the resoluteness of the jawline. Their dress, from their impregnable but shapely breastplates to their easy movement skirts, is designed with the form and movement of the body in mind, and their hard physiques recall the proportions of Greek statuary. Even the food in the mess is prepared to not only be savorable to the taste, but attractive to the eye. Just now, the Architrilinus, the chef, is beginning to prepare the carrots. He dices each piece lengthwise, then lengthwise again, to achieve slender, elongated triangles. We look out across the river to the barbarian host, who in the slanting gray light of winter mass like figures in a nightmare. Their hair, both of head and face, is uncut, vilified dress with oil braided in abhorrent shapes. Their bodies are tortured by ornaments and discolored paint. Some of the men are huge and muscular at the point of deformity, their legs wrapped comically in the garments called placas, breeches. There's no discipline among them. They bellow at each other and race about in chaos. They are dirty and they stink. A crone in a filthy blanket stirs a cauldron, slicing roots and bits of rancid meat into the concoction. From time to time, she slices a carrot crosswise up in shafts so that the circular piece she cuts off floats like foolish yellow eyes on the surface of her brew. This unequal portrait of the two forces would not only have been the Roman view, it could have almost have been the German view as well. For the milling hosts are of Germanic origin, are all of the intruders of this period. To the Romans, the German tribes were riffraffs. To the Germans, the Romans' side of the river was the place to be. The nearest we can come to understanding this divide may be the southern border of the United States. There's a split, and Polish troops are immigrants. Isn't this interesting? I'm reading this. There's the split and Polish troops are immigration police. The hordes, the Mexicans, Haitians, and other dispossessed people seeking illegal entry. This was written in 1995. The barbarian migration was not perceived as a threat by Romans simply because it was a migration, a year in, year out, ragtaggle migration, and not an organized armed assault. In fact, it had been going on for centuries. The Gauls had been the first barbarian inventors hundreds of years before, and now Gaul lay at peace. Gaul is France. The verses of its poets and the products of its vineyards were twin fountains of Roman inspiration. The Gauls had become more Roman than the Roman themselves. Why could not the same thing happen to these Vandals? Allen and Suez, now working themselves to a fever pitch on the far side of the river. When at last the hapless Germans made their charge across the bridge of ice, it is head on, without forethought or strategy. With prosperous courage, they team across the Rhine in convulsive waves. Their principal weapons, their own desperation. We get a sense of their numbers as well as their desperation. In a single casualty count, the Vandals alone are thought to have lost 20,000 men, not counting women and children at the crossing. Despite their discipline, the Roman cannot hold back the German sea. From one perspective, at least, the Romans were overwhelmed by numbers, not just in this encounter, but during centuries of migration across the porous borders of the empire. Sometimes the barbarians came in waves through, though seldom as big as this one. More often they came in trickles as craftsmen who sought honest employment, as warriors who enlisted with the Roman legions, as tribal chieftains who paid for land, as marauders who burned and looted and sometimes raped and murdered. What set them on the move was agriculture, which they had learned from the Roman neighbors. As the barbarian societies to the north of the empire turned from the nomadic ways of the hunter to the settled ways of the farmer, a seasonably predictable store of grain caused the inevitable population explosion. For all too obvious reasons, farmers live longer lives and see far more of their young reach adulthood than hunters whose precarious lives and those of their progeny are lived like an ecological high-wire act without a net. For farmers, the safety net is the grain supply. More food than they need right now. The ancient form of money in the bank has served from time immemorial as the basis for long life, long-term planning, and all the arts of civilization. But the complete formula is an invariable as it is archaic. Economic success in the form of a store of grain triggers a population explosion, which quickly triggers the need to acquire new land to feed new mouths. 11 centuries prior to the encounter on the Rhine, an insignificant band of Latin-speaking farmers had but recently settled down to fixed agriculture and solve the problem of rapidly growing numbers by embarking upon a career of conquests that ultimately eventuated in the Roman Empire. Remarks. The contemporary historian William McNeill considered in this light the Roman state in the West was destroyed by the same force that it had created. McNeill thus takes the sensible, need-based route of Machiavelli. But as the classical historians have shown us, there are other lights in which to consider this enormous transformation. Why was the border guard so thin? Did the Roman not notice at some point that their way of life was changing forever? They did not think to do something about it besides bow to the inevitable. What were they thinking about? In order to answer these questions and gain a full picture of Roman society, we turn to a typical Roman who helped to build the world of late antiquity. The barbarian onslaught across the frozen Rhine occurred in the first decade of the 5th century. Let us step back a bit into the 4th century and meet a man whose style of life can show us some of the yawning absences in Roman society, absences that would lead directly to the calamities of the 5th century. He is Ausenius the poet, and he kept an impressive, large, exquisitely maintained country estate in Bordeaux in the province of Gaul, and after his father's death, another equally impressive estate in Aquitaine. Born just 100 years before the German migration over the Rhine, he was raised not by his mother, of whom he doesn't seem to have had specially fond memories, but by two battle axes, a grandmother and an aunt, both named Amelia. In his Parentialia, which might not be best translated, here, let me try to read it. Obsequies for the forebears. He extols their virtue of grandmother Amelia. He recalls, Ah, non delicia. Oh, it's in Italian. To questionable pleasure she gave me no quarter, but held both herself and her household rigidly upright. The other Amelia seems to have been a larger part. Amelia, nicknamed Lusty in your cradle, because you were as much fun as a boy, and without trying you always looked a bit like a lad. The rhetorical progression we are meant to notice here takes on 3 stages of growth in 3 lines of poetry. Infant, boy, adolescent. Amelia, though strapping, never growing quite a bit as big as a man, somehow ever does keep growing in Amelia. Aunt Amelia gets higher marks than grandmother Amelia, even if she must often have been severe towards the child Ansonius, who is a man designed so resolute, in fact, that though I'm having some fun with this poetry. Frankly, I'm going to skip this poetry thing because it's not helping, in my opinion. This was not, somebody should have edited, in my opinion. Let's go right into, there are endless sequences about forebears, about formal teachers, about daily life, about classical subjects, the heroes of the Trojan War, the 12 Caesars, endless word games, endless imitations of Virgil. He has one hot poem, Cento Nuptialias, hot enough to be left untranslated in the Lobe. On Cineas, where he has titillated as many generations of aging Latinists as it has been frustrating generations of schoolboy. A clinical, cynical description of a bride's deflowering on her wedding night. Yet even here he is deliberately unoriginal. Every phrase is taken from the poems of Virgil. Thus, does he mean to avoid censure by appealing to the ultimate literary authority and to win admiration by a dazzling display of his knowledge of Virgil? But apart from these homages, there's almost never a memorable phrase, just high-class jingles written to formula. His letters, also endless, are no better. There's seldom any necessary information to be communicated. Insights are scarce and genuine emotion is almost absent. Okay, I get why he did that. I get what, so 100 years in the 4th century, what he's showing, I'm just going to be blunt, is bimbo mentality. So 100 years before Rome falls, what is popularized by the society of Rome, the Roman society, civilization, is that there's just bullshit, just mindless, endless chatter of bullshit, distractions. And these distractions are considered, interesting, necessary, but it's creating a bimbo community. I'm just using the word bimbo. It's a stupid, absent-minded community. It's a whole civilization parroting Virgil and Cicero and Aristotle and the great minds, parroting it, but not even understanding anything. Parroting the Trojan Wars, parroting the Spartan Wars, parroting just bullshit. And so in this moment, and he's celebrated. So the poetical fame of Ausonius condemns the taste of his age. Did you hear that? The poetical fame of Ausonius condemns the state of his age, the taste of his age. His age was filled with uneducated, self-congratulatory, arrogant, we are Romans, we're the greatest nation in the world, we own the world, right? But absolutely uneducated and parroting shit they don't even understand. It's like giving a poem to A 7-year-old who has no idea, can remember it by memory, but has no idea what every word, what the words mean. Not one fucking clue. Not one clue. If you ask the kid, what did you just read or say? They wouldn't be able to tell you. So the fall of the Roman Empire isn't what we think. It wasn't the hordes. It wasn't the barbarians, the Vandals. It was internal. Yes, there was deviancy, but it wasn't even that. It was the fact that we had absolutely stripped people to learn how to think, how to philosophize, and how to structure concept, like Pericles, the great statement in Greece. Pericles was a statement, and he could formulate ideas of justice and democracy. And we've lost all these speeches that were, I'm sure, had scribes scribbling away as Pericles would stand and make his statement. We have fractions of what they were saying. How could a grown man have spent so much time too foolishly? Well, it's what everyone else was doing. There's a static world. Civilized life, like the cultivation of Ausonia's magnificent Bordeaux vineyards, lies in doing well what it has been doing. Doing the expected is the highest value, and the second highest value, like it, receiving the appropriate admiration of one's peers for doing it. We are celebrating fucking mediocre human beings, and we have for a long time. And we celebrate the circus, our athletes. We celebrate actors. We celebrate the most mundane human beings. A long time ago, I started realizing that what we looked up to was never as interesting as the common man or woman. The common man and woman were fascinating, actually. Fascinating. The kid that decided to fucking walk across Nepal, barefoot for the fuck of it, with a backpack. The girl that decided that it wasn't a bad idea to get her Peugeot across the Sahara Desert, sell it in Morocco, and go to America on a one-way plane ticket to Los Angeles to figure it out with her sewing machine. That's interesting to me. I don't care about Paris Hilton. I don't care about these assholes. I don't. Do you? I mean, do you really care about Kim Kardashian? What has she done? She sucked cock. That's it. And she's famous for it. That's it. What's famous is the most mediocre of our people. And the most fascinating. And what he's saying in this book is the reason why Rome fell is we were looking up and kissing each other's ass. The most mediocre of our more successful Roman citizens were absolutely setting themselves up to fall. And the real minds that could have philosophized did not have access to the books. I'll tell you that. I'll just add that to it because that's common sense. They were busy surviving. They did not have access to the books. And what are they doing to books? They are destroying books because they want to own knowledge and own the knowledge, and then edit the knowledge and manipulate the knowledge to manipulate you. That's what's changed. By the way, I just got a flag for saying cock. Okay, whatever. Because God forbid we should talk like adults in a room. So I'm going to repeat that line. How could a grown man have spent so much time so foolishly? Well, it's what everyone else was doing. This is a static world, civilized life. Like the cultivation of Ausonia's magnificent Bordeaux vineyards lies in doing well for what has been done before. Doing the expected is the highest value. And the second highest value is like it. Receiving the appropriate admiration of one's peers for doing it. Though Ausonius is a Christian convert, as is Horatio, shows his Christianity is cloaked to be donned and removed at needed. Did you hear this? His Christianity is a cloak to be donned and removed as needed. It was no doubt what everyone else was doing. His real worldview glimmers through all his work, a sort of agnostic paganism that enables him to evoke the silent shades of the pagan underworld without ever giving the reader the sense that he believes in any world but this one. In Ausonius and all the other best people of his age, so like one another, it is difficult to tell them apart. We see the flaw in Gibbon's analysis of Rome's fall. The vigorous gods of Rome were not eclipsed by some effeminate Eastern fantasy religion. Fecute Venus and bloody Mars did not vacate the field to the pathetic pacifist Christ. Rather, the life of the old religion had already drained away, and by the time Christianity came to the attention of the Roman gentry, the gods were shadows of their formerly lively selves, marginalized, quieti manas, rustling through a dimly viewed eternity. It is no accident that when we today think of the Danube and the Rhine, the two rivers that divided the civilized world from the world of the northern barbarians, what comes to mind are not the ghostly gods of Rome, but the vigorous gods of the German tribes. Ausonius made his career as a grammaticus, a professor of Latin, at Bordeaux, which then boasted one of the empire's great universities. His fame as a teacher reached even the imperial court, and after 30 years in academe, he was summoned to the Golden Palace of Milan, for the royal family no longer resided in Rome, to become tutor to Gratian, son of Valentinius, emperor of the West. When in 368 Grantius was ordered to accompany his father in an anti-German campaign, Ausonius went along as a sort of poet laureate to the expedition, rising suitably to the occasion with his usual bland results. Though this is also the period of the barracks humor, of the sensu nupilias, written, so Ausonius informs us, as a suggestion of the emperor himself. As one of his spoils of war, Anthonius won the service of a German slave girl whose charms he sang in his Bisilos sequence: morsel, blandishment, sport, desire, climax, barbarian, but you, kid, are ahead of all the Latin girls. It begins to sound like real poetry, which each noun alluding to the mounting tension of the poet's arousal, till at the very moment of orgasm, Barbara is moan, but then you'd realize he's just aping Catullus. In 375, the boy Gratian reached the throne, sharing it with his brother Valentinian II on the death of their father. And it is at that point that Ausonius' star enters its imperium. He has become Castro Sacri Balati, a sort of chief of staff to the emperors. In the same year, his aged father, pushing 90, is named to the honorary post of prefect of Illyricum. In the next, his son is made proconsul of Africa. More honors tumble forth for father, for son, for son-in-law, for nephew, and then in 379, Ausonius is named consul, the highest position any Roman apart from the royal family can attain. This monkey, this absolute idiot, becomes consul to the emperor of the Roman Empire that is falling. It's amazing. And what do you see now? Do you see the connection of what's happening? Let's continue. In the old days of Republican Rome, the consuls there were two of them, so each could keep the other honest, elected for a term of 1 year to thus preventing dictatorship. Oh, Lord. And had been the executive pinnacle of Roman government. But in the decisive sea battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian had defeated his fellow consul Mark Antony, who had soiled republican virtue by lolling with Cleopatra in Egypt. Nobly seizing the imperial power, Octavian became Augustus Caesar, the first emperor, and the consulship were henceforth transformed into honorary position, vestigial reminders of the republican virtue and utterly ornamental. The consulship were not only the ornamental offices in Roman society, the eternal city was filled with the coming and goings of impotent men, senators, magistrates, bustling administrators of all kinds, performing meaningless duties. Augustus, while seizing all power, had widely left in place all the republican trappings. The empty show that resulted only emphasized the more the importance of how things were done, since no one wished to advert the vanity of what was being done. During the 4 centuries that elapsed from the time of Augustus to the time of Ausonius, the life of the capital turned even more unsubstantial and brittle, so that some ceremony or other meticulous executed could become the apogee of a man's life. In Ausonius' case, the ceremony took the form of a convoluted oration, his gratirium actio, or act of thanksgiving, given at the end of his consular year, in which he preferred incredibly elaborate and intermental thanks to the divine emperor's august presence. The divine emperor's power rested above all in his office of imperator, commander-in-chief, the office whose importance had been so greatly expanded during the political upheaval of Augustus' day. Can I just say something? This book should be required reading in every high school in America. Required reading. On the list. And then an essay, no less than 12 pages, as to how this connects to our timeline. That's how you breed, you raise thinkers, not idiots, who parrot bullshits to pass tests and the SAT score. God forbid. You're a genius. You scored a perfect score. Yeah, but can you think? Can you actually think an original thought? Can you fucking literally connect the dots? Or are you just a parrot? Let's continue. But almost as important as his military power was his power to tax. And it came to pass in those days, wrote Luke in the most famous passage on the Roman taxation in all of literature, that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Thus, in Jesus' birth, set in the reign of the first emperor, toto ergo in pace composito, all the world being at peace, as a chronicler of the 5th century would soon describe it. But the peace of all the world worth thinking about, that is, came at a stiff price, the constant and increasingly unequal exertion of the emperor's taxmen. Let's continue. We know again from the gospel the hatred of the Jews of the 1st century for the Roman tax collectors, but by the time Ansonius, that hatred was universal. But now I must ask a great concession of my readers. To pity the poor taxman, whose life was far more miserable than the lives of those who suffered his exactions. The taxman, or curiolus, was born that way. Can you imagine the dawning horror on realizing that you were born into a class of worms who were expected to spend their entire adult life spans collecting taxes from their immediate neighbors, and that there was no way out? But this was only the beginning of the horror. Whatever the curiolus were unable to collect, they had to make a good out of their own resources. Who were these wretches, and how were they assigned their doom, since tax collection was patently beneath the dignity of the Ausonius class of great landowners? The tax of collection fell to the next level down, to the small landowners, the squirens, who had amassed just enough land to hold their head up in polite society. Originally viewed as the first rung on the ladder of social betterment, the office of curiolus had become, by the age of Ausonius, a cruel trap from which there was little chance of escape. Of course, they tried to escape, especially during this period, as the tax base shrank in gold. Many taxes had to be paid, rose in value against silver by about 1% a year. For a time, the wealthiest curios succeeded in bribing their way onto the list of senators, for the Senate was the cream of Roman society and the ancient, if ineffectual, symbol of its past republican glory. Did you hear that? To be a senator was the ultimate role. We have senators that are on life support, still fucking in office. I think you know who I'm talking about. We have senators that are like El Cid. We have senators that they can barely fucking drive themselves anywhere, but we are allowing them to actually pass laws. Let's continue. I love reading history. This is why when you read books like that, it should just the dots connect so fast it's stupid. It's crazy. So when you're talking to someone who can't fucking think they can't figure this shit out, you're like, I don't understand. And then you realize they haven't read anything. They haven't read ancient history. They haven't read philosophy. They don't have discussions about politics in the ancient world and the present world. 40 years ago, how it was different. Wars that were worthless wars, wasteful wars. The psychology of war. The trauma returned to the lands. The conquerors coming back home to their wives and children. Completely fucked up. One example is the Vietnam War. For the Senate was the cream of Roman society, and the ancient, if ineffectual, symbol of its past republican glory, and senators paid no taxes. Others bribed their way out of their curial rank and into the ranks of the bureaucratic honeycomb, such as the enormous Palatine service. Some won commissions in the army, others sought refuge in priestly consecration. At the lowest end, curiales exchanged their birthright to become members of a college of laborers, such as the grain importers and those engaged in river traffic. The most desperate, and as the century drew to its close, they were becoming an even larger plurality, borrowed from the only available lender, the lord of a local manor, whose class connection, as we can imply from the case of Ausenius, effectively exempted him from taxation. The lord was always happy to oblige. Not only did he gain new relief from any shadow of taxation, for his debtor was both his tax assessor and his tax collector. In the end, after the curiales inevitably defaulted, his pleasant little farm would be added to the lord's expanding network of states. Thus did the taxman often find himself a skilled but land-poor laborer, usually working for the local lord. It's how serfdom began. Sometimes the pitiable man and his family would sink so low as to become serfs, what did I just say, on the land where once it was theirs. But the emperor had no intention of standing idly by his tax collectors disappeared. He soon closed off all means of escape by legislating that curiales could not travel or sell their property without permission. Those in the Palatine service and the army were ordered back to their native stations. They still could become senators, providing they passed through all the grades of curiales, and on reaching the highest principalities, remained in it for 15 years. If anyone skipped a grade, he was like a piece on a board game, to be returned to his starting point. The brutality of these people must have been unhinged on the poor class, unhinged to pay their taxes. By the 5th century, in the years before the complete collapse of Roman government, the imperial approach to taxation had produced a caste as hopeless as any history. Their rapacious exactions, taken wherever and whenever they could, were the direct result of their desperation about their own increasing unpayable tax bill. As they nerved up, outcasts commenced to prey on whoever was weaker than they. The rich became richer. The great landowners ate up the little ones. The tax base shrank still further, and the middle classes, never encouraged by the Roman state, began to disappear from the face of the earth. Did you hear that? Did you hear that? Nor would they return till the appearance of the Italian mercantile families of the high Middle Ages. The fall of the Roman Empire is what we're reading. It wasn't the hordes. The hordes didn't have a shot in hell until this happened internally. Let's continue. In Flight of the Curiales, indeed, we hear the first faint notes of the medieval polity. As they increasingly swelled the ranks of the great lord's tenants, they were creating the fiefdoms of medieval Europe, a complete with title family, skilled artisans or freemen, and serf bound to the land. As the Germanic tribes poured over Gaul and Spain, and at last across the Italian peninsula, they settled down and took up farming like their Romanized neighbors. Their chiefs, too, became great lords of a kind, extending protection in return for labor and produce. To a fugitive tax collector, as to many other Romans on the run, the estate of a German chief could look considerably more attractive than that of his Roman counterpart. The German would welcome the fugitive's language, his connection, and his many civilized skills with rough enthusiasm. And the German would never have heard the word curiales. Thus did the great estates gradually become laws unto themselves in a time of spreading civil chaos, grow slowly into the little kingdom of the age of Charlemagne. We should not think of the emperors as active persecutors of the poor, curiales. They actually thought of themselves as protecting them and all Roman citizens from the cruel vagaries of life beyond the Roman orbis, and after all, what blessedness would be greater than the honor of the Roman citizenship? An imperial edict of this period even tries to shame the recusant curiales by reminding them of their noble rank, of the splendor of their birth. Rather, the bureaucratic and social establishment of Rome had become so top-heavy and entrenched that effective reform was no longer possible. Class was insulated from class. We cannot imagine Ananias, for instance, giving a thought to the suffering of any but his own. Does that sound familiar? The lack of empathy. It's not my problem until it's my problem. The Passio Curialis, had it ever crossed his mind, would only have prompted another clever little poem for his friend to chuckle at. In Ansonius, we encounter the complete extinction of res publica, the public thing, social concern. Did you hear that? In all his extent corpus, there is but one appearance by a person not of Ausonius' class, Bisula, the German slave girl with the funny name, who is there only to prop up Ausonia's manhood. The emperor's worst headache was the army itself. Starved for taxes, he was unable to maintain a force that could withstand the ever-strengthening barbarian onslaught. But since the time of Constantine, new emperors had come from the army, or at least been approved by the army, so that the existence of the army was a veiled threat to every reigning emperor. The army had made emperors and pulled them from their throne, and one was hard put to recall an emperor who had lasted more than a few years or had died in his bed. In 383, the army in Britain mutinied, and under the leadership of Maximus, crossed to the continent and began to occupy Gaulish cities. Young Gratian was assassinated at Lyon and his brother driven from Italy. Ausonius' career was over. By the time order was restored under a new emperor, Theodosius, in 388, Ausonius was too old for public life. Though it is difficult to imagine the Pax Romana lasting as long as it did without the increasing militarization of the Imperium Romanum, the Roman themselves were never happy about their army. It suggested dictatorship rather than those good old republican values, and they preferred to avert their eyes, keeping themselves carefully ignorant of the army's essential contribution to their well-being. With the moral decay of republican resolve, the army became more and more a reserve of non-Romans, half-Romanized, barbarian mercenaries, and servants sent in the stead of freemen who couldn't be bothered. In the last days of the empire, men commonly mutilated themselves to escape service, though such a crime was, in theory, punishable by torture and death. Military levies sent to the great estates met such resistance that influential landowners were allowed to send money instead of men to the army. In 409, faced with an increasingly undefeated frontier, the emperor announced the impossible. Henceforth, slaves would be permitted, even encouraged to enlist, and for their service they would receive a bounty and their freedom. It sounds like people in jail being pushed to just join the army, doesn't it? By this point, it was sometimes difficult to tell the Romans from the barbarians, at least along the frontier. There are no doubt lessons here for the contemporary reader. The changing character of the native population brought about through unremarked pressures on porous borders, the creation of an increasingly unwieldy and rigid bureaucracy whose own survival becomes so overriding goal, the despising of the military and the avoidance of his service by established families. Do you understand? While its offices present unprecedented opportunity for marginalized men to whom its rank had once been closed. Do you understand that the leaders of every army in ancient history was run and held by the sons of noble families? Do you understand that? Alexander the Great came from a noble family. Hannibal Barca came from a noble family. And literally the sons of noble families were involved in protecting their borders of their land. Not scruffy farm boys moving up the ranks. That wasn't how it was. I would say General Patton came from a well-to-do family. He went to West Point. But let's continue. While its offices present unprecedented opportunity for marginalized men to whom its ranks had once been closed, the lip service paid to values long dead, the pretense that we still are what we once were, the increasing concentration of the populace into richer and poorer by the way of corrupt tax systems, and the desperation that inevitably follows, the aggrandizement of executive power at the expense of the legislator, ineffectual legislation promulgated with great show, the moral vocation of the man at the top to maintain order at all costs while growing blind to the cruel dilemma of ordinary life. Cruel dilemma of ordinary life. These are all themes from which our world is familiar. Not are they the God-given property of any party or political point of view, even though we often act as if they were, Republican, Democrat. Vote blue, vote red. At least the emperor could not heap his economic burdens on posterity by creating long-term public debt, for floating capital had not yet been conceptualized. The only kind of wealth worth speaking of were the fruits of the earth. Controlling water, controlling food. Though it is easy for us to perceive the wild instability of the Roman Empire in its final days, it was not easy for the Romans. Rome, the eternal city, had been untouchable since the Celts of Gaul had sacked it by surprise in 390 BC. In the ensuing 8 centuries, Rome built itself into the world's only superpower, unassailable save for the occasional war on distant border. The Gauls had long since become civilized Romans, and Rome offered the same Romanization to anyone who wanted it, sometimes, as with the Jews, whether they wanted to or not. Normally, though, everyone was dying to be Roman, as everyone wants to be a Roman. What does that sound like? As Theodoric, the homely king of the Ostrogoths, was found of saying, an able Goth wants to be like a Roman, only a poor Roman would want to be like a Goth. This arrogance is really arrogance connects with stupidity. The citizens of the city of Rome, therefore, could not believe it when towards the end of the first decade of the 5th century they woke to find Alaric, king of the Visigoths, and all his forces parked at their gates. He might as well have been the king of the Fuzzy Wuzzies or any other of the inconsequential outlanders that civilized people had looked down their noses at throughout history. It was preposterous. They dispatched a pair of envoys to conduct the tiresome negotiations and sent him away. The envoys began with empty threats. Any attack on Rome was doomed, for it would be met by invincible strength and innumerable ranks of warriors. Alaric was a sharp man, and in his rough fashion, a just one. He also had a sense of humor. The thicker the grass, the more easily scythed, he replied evenly. The envoys quickly recognized that their man was no fool. All right, then. What was the price of his departure? Alaric told them his men would sweep through the city, taking all gold, all silver, and everything of value that could be moved. They would also round up and cart off every barbarian slave. But protested the historical envoys, what will that leave us? Alaric paused. Your lives. And in that pause, Roman security died, and a new world was conceived. What was lost? The complexity of the classical tradition. So they kept their lives, most of them, but sooner or later, they or their progeny lost almost everything else: titles, property, way of life, learning, especially learning. A world in chaos is not a world in which books are copied and libraries maintained. Did you hear that? It is not a world where learned men have the leisure to become more learned. It is not a world for which the Grammaticus schedules regular classes of young scholars and knowledge is dutifully transmitted year by placid year. Between the sack of Rome by Alaric at 410 and the death of the last Western emperor in 476, the imperium became increasingly unstable. The large landowners, more and more laws unto themselves, ignored the emperor's decrees, going even as far as to use the great public edifices as quarries for private palaces. Rome itself, abandoned by the emperors for the most defensible marches of Ravenna, saw the splendor of its public buildings crumble before the destructiveness of private greed. Though the emperors announced dire punishment for any official who cooperated in this destruction. 50 pounds of gold for a magistrate, a flogging, and the loss of both hands for a subordinate. The looting continued, unabated. The Vandals were not the only Vandals. The straight Roman road, solidly paved, unwilling to compromise with the vagaries of local landscaper for centuries, the symbol of safe and unmolested travel, now presented the likelihood of unwelcome adventure. Not only were there bands of thieves, robbers, increasingly composed of the ruined and the dispossessed, the emperor's own curiosity, a combination of highway police and custom guards, began to extort bribes from travelers, desperate to reach places of greatest safety, often halting the wayfarers' progress when they had no more bribes to proffer. Throughout the countrysides, once the very image of Roman peace, illegal brotherhoods of extortionists formed. The proto-mafiosi, Curialists, and other struggle middle-class townsmen who had been accustomed to sending their infants to be nursed by shepherds in pure mountain air began to find it impossible to retrieve those children, snatched away to inaccessible mountain fastness. The children were raised brutally as shepherd slaves, and the name shepherd became synonymous with thief, kidnapper, trafficker, and children. The fear of such kidnapping still finds echoes in the lost children and loathsome adults who haunt the deep wood of European fairy tales. As barbarians' attacks became not a distant possibility, but the order of the day, records of ownership and purchase were often lost in raids, thus presenting a fine opportunity to the emperor's discosados, the super curiales. The rapacious bullies would descend with a large retinue on a recently looted farm, demanding of this disoriented owner that he render all accounts forthwith. What would follow, as described in the emperor's own reform-minded, if ineffective edict, is enough to curl one's hair. Thence, innumerable daughters, savage imprisoned, the cruelty of hanging, and every kind of torture. The borders of the empire were contradicting. By the end of the third decade of the 5th century, the grain-heavy plain of northern Africa, Rome's breadbasket, was lost to the Vandals, who had already seized or savaged large swaths of Spain and Gaul. Through most of the century, various armies of Goths, then of Huns, driving westward over the Danube, decimating the eastern provinces, marched up and down the Italian peninsula, raising panic and leaving desolation. As the 5th century opened, the Roman garrison in Britain was already on its way to depletion, so desperately were soldiers needed elsewhere. By 410, the year of Alaric's sack, it had been withdrawn completely, exposing Britons more than ever to the deportation of the German Angles and Saxons on its eastern shore, and to the even more terrifying slave raids of the Celts of Ireland along its jagged western bays. One of the most horrifying features of the period is the wholesale enslavement of freemen and women. Estate agents for the greater lords often acted as redeemers of Roman citizens seized in barbarian raids. The object was unusually not the freedom of the Roman prisoner, but his fresh enslavement as a serf on the landlord's estate. The ransom paid was a cheap price for a lifetime of service from the liberating prisoner. Sometimes the ruse was even simpler. At the time of an invitation, a local farmer would be given shelter for himself and his family on a great estate, only to find that when the barbarian hordes had passed, neither he nor his would ever be free to leave. The barbarians, too, were likely to enslave whomever they could lay their hands on. In the slavery business, no tribe was fiercer or more feared than the Irish. They were excellent sailors in skin-covered crafts that were maneuvered with consummate skill. Just before dawn, a small war party would move in stealthy oval coracles into a little cove, approach an isolated farmhouse with silent strides, grab some sleeping children, and be halfway back to Ireland before anyone knew what had happened. The Irish moved in a large war party as well. One day, in 401 or thereabouts, a great fleet of black coracles swept up the west coast of Britain, probably into the Severn estuary. and seizing, according to an eyewitness, many thousands of young prisoners, returned to them to a slave market in Ireland. We still have this testimony of one of the captives, a boy of 16 who called himself Praticus. He tells us that his father, Calpurnius, was, God himself, God help him, a Curiolus, and that his grandfather, Potitus, had been a Catholic priest. So he was a middle-class lad, a Romanized Briton, looking forward to a classical education and a career. Not surprisingly, he was not interested in following in his father's footsteps. I sold my noble rank. I blush not to state it, nor am I sorry. Whatever the plan of this brash young man, they were cut short by the terrible Irish raid. He finds himself chastened exceedingly and humbled in truth by hunger and nakedness, and that daily. As a shepherd slave in the Irish district of Antrim, as the property of a local king named Miliuk, what became of Praticus will form the subject of a later chapter. After we have left the civilized world for good and journey to the unholy land of Ireland. But before we bid good night to the late classical world and make our way to the fiercest of the fierce barbarians, we must consider one last question. What was lost when the Roman Empire fell? The life of Augustinus can show us why of the fall, but it gives us nothing to weep for classical civilization. The world that came to birth in the Athens of Pericles 5 centuries before Christ, that dies now 500 years after Christ in this century of the barbarian invasion, is worth a far better elegy than Augustinius can provide. What died when no one any longer had the leisure to pass on the essentials of the classical traditions, when the barbarians burned the libraries, the books turned to dust, and when the stones remained were reassembled into rural outhouses. We find the answers in the life of Augustine of Hippo, almost the last great classical man and very nearly the first medieval man. Just 30 years before Patricus was brought in chains to Ireland, another teenager with a similar background, a Romanized African, whose father was a petty official, came all too willingly, not to an impossible hinterland, but to the seething capital of Roman Africa. To Carthage I came, recalled Augustine later, where they sang all around me in my ears a cauldron of unholy loves, and yet I loved not one, yet I loved to love, and out of deep-seated need I hated myself for not being needy. I pursued whoever, whatever might be lovable, in love with love. Safety I hated, and any course without danger from within me was a famine. This is clear, poignant, ruthless prose, but though it still reads awfully well, the words of Augustine's Confessions no longer jump with the fresh shock they held when he published his memoir in 401. Probably the same year Patricus was kidnapped. The reason for this is that Augustine's is a sensibility that has since become so common that we no longer experience the Confessions as the earthquake they felt to be by readers of late antiquity. For Augustus is the first human being to say I, and to mean what we mean today. His Confessions are therefore the first genuine autobiography in human history. The implications of this are staggering, and even today difficult to encompass. A good start is made, of course, by reading the Confessions themselves and falling upon their spell. But in order to grasp the enormity of Augustine's achievement, one must read the autobiographies that went before him. Open any collection of great thoughts or great sayings, especially one like Bartlett's goes in chronological order, and let your eyes pick out the I's. In the oldest literature, their paucity and lack of force will begin to impress you. Of course, characters in Homer refer to themselves occasionally as I. Socrates even speaks of his daemon, his inner spirit. But personal revelation says that we, such as we are utterly accustomed to, is nowhere to be found. Even lyrical poems tend to be objective by their standards, and the exceptions stand out. A fragment, "The moon has set," attributed to Sappho, and the psalm attributed to King David. When in the classical period we reach for the first works to be designated as autobiographies, we can only be confounded by the impersonal tone. Marcus Aurelius, by Gibbon's standards, the most enlightened emperor and the great philosopher of Roman antiquity, speaks to us in epigrams like Confucius and ecclesiastic before him. This being of mine, whatever it reality is, consists of little flesh, a little breath, and the part which governs. He means his mind. This is confidential as Marcus gets. Or how about this for a personal revelation? All that is harmony for you, my universe, is in harmony with me as well. Nothing comes at the right time for you is too early or too late for me. For all their ponderous, the great emperor's thoughts are never more personal than a Chinese fortune cookie. When we reach Augustine, who tells us everything, his jealousies in infancy, his thieving as a boy, his stormy relationship with his overbearing mother, the ever-certain Monica, his years of philandering, his breakdowns, his shameful love for an unnamed peasant woman who he finally sends away, his self-loathing is as modern as that of a character in Camus or Beckett, and as concrete. I carried inside me a cut and a bleeding soul, and how to get rid of it, I just don't know. I sought every pleasure, the countryside, sports, fooling around, the peace of a garden, friends and good company, sex, reading. My soul floundered in the wind and void and came back upon me. For where could my heart flee from my heart? Where could I escape from myself? No one had ever talked this way before. If we page quickly through world literature from its beginning to the advent of Augustine, we realize that with Augustine, human consciousness takes a quantum leap forward and becomes self-conscious. Here, for the first time, in a man constantly observing himself, not as a man, but as this singular man, Augustine. From this point on, true autobiography becomes possible, and so does its near relative, subjective, and autobiographical fiction. Fiction had always been there in the form of storytelling, but now for the first time there glimmers the possibility of psychological fiction, the subjective story, the story of the soul. Through the cry of Augustine, the man who cried, I, will seldom be heard again in full force until the early modern period. He is the father not only of autobiography, but of the modern novel. He is also a distinction forebearer of the modern science of psychology. What prepared Augustine to be Augustine? What was the ground and what was the seed? Augustine was among the last of classically educated men born in 354 into what all believed to be a stable world. He would witness in old age in the 1420s the last days of the Grammaticus. His Latin had a refinement and a piquancy that few could match in any period of antiquity. The delicate changes rung on three words: love, need, hate. In the famous passage from the Confessions quoted above, mark him as an adhering to the highest standard of classical rhetoric. What Ansonius roar like a medal, Augustine bears stamped on his heart. The show-off accomplishment of Ansonius are for Augustine honored disciplines of the spirit. Augustine gives us the world's first description of how a child may fall hopelessly in love with literature. A fall of palatable, it is almost carnal. Like creative children in every age, he despised his first school assignment in reading, writing, and arithmetic because they were nothing but notes, root. 1 and 1 are 2, 2 and 2 are 4. What hateful sing-song. Nor did he like any better his first lessons in Greek, accompanied by the teacher's punishment and cruel threats. And he states succinctly the complaint of numberless generations of students before and after him. Mastering a foreign language was bitter as gall, for not one word of it did I understand. But then, after all the dreary classes of grinding recitation, he is handed real literature in his own tongue. I love Latin, and I wept for Dido slain, she seeking by the sword a stroke and wound extreme. Despering Dido, queen of ancient Carthage, slain by her own hand, as her magnificent lover, Anicius, lifts anchor and sails away forever. This is one of the most haunting and permanent images of the classic world. What opened Augustine's heart to Latin literature was Virgil's Aeneid. the literature masterpiece of the Roman world, its Bible, its Shakespeare in one. The Aeneid is a conscious literary epic, not a folk epic like the Greek Iliad, picking up where Homer leaves off with the fall of Troy, to the Greek forces who penetrate its impregnable walls by the gift of a huge hollow horse lined with armed men. Virgil recounts the exploits of his hero, Aeneas, son of Venus, and a Trojan father, Arma vicurucum cano, I sing of arms and the man, begins Virgil in a great trumpet fanfare. As all of Virgil's readers could savor with thrilling foreknowledge, Aeneas will miraculously escape the certain doom of burning Troy. Faithfully carrying his ancient father on his back and holding his little son by the hand. A wanderer, he is received with high celebration by the queen of Carthage, who is riveted by his tale. Dido and Aeneas are fated to fall passionately in love, but Aeneas always knows, as does the reader, that though it will break Dido's heart and end her life, he must move bravely on to his destiny, the founding of the city of Rome. Virgil wrote in the age of Caesar Augustus, the first emperor, and he conceived the Aeneid as a national epic, the only completely successful one in world literature, orchestrated artfully to evoke in the reader a wave of patriotism for the empire's heroic beginning. This younger, less seasoned civilization of the Latin West, having absorbed both politically and culturally the lofty civilization of the Greek East, needed to establish its own legendary to rule and to overwhelm. To the Greeks, the Romans were cocky and underbred. To the Romans, the Greeks were too clever by half and more than a little unsavory. In observing a refined Hellen flaunt his superiority, your regular plainsfolk Roman could not help but let the suspicion of perversion play at the back of his mind by Jupiter. The cultural relations of Roman to Greek was in many ways not unlike the cultural relationships of Englishmen to Frenchmen and of American to Englishmen. In all three relations, simplicity is the virtue and complexity the vice on one side, while on the other, subtly, is a prize, and supposedly rustic straightforwardness can give offense. I'm better than you. I'm greater than you. I'm more powerful than you. In Virgil's new myth, forthright, Rome is the moral superior of sneaky Greece, and surprise, actually the older civilization, since it can trace its roots to fabled Ilium, ancient Troy. Virgil makes his new myth unforgettable by framing it in a new language that rivals anything Greece was ever produced, a heroic but flexible Latin that still rings down the ages. In recounting the story of the hollow horse by which the Greeks won through duplicity what they could not win fair and square on the field of battle, Aeneas warns not only Dido but all of subsequent humanity, Timeo, Danaos, et dona ferantis, I am wary of Greeks, even bearing gifts. In Dido, there is more than a hint of another dusky African queen, the Cleopatra whose Eastern sensuality didn't mark Antony, but our hero, Aeneas, is virtuous enough in the end to reject even this temptation against his and every Roman's destiny. Of course, he is flesh and blood, and no prig either, and the lovemaking of these two is the occasion from some of Virgil's most exciting poetry. But Dido's suicide, though genuinely tragic, is necessary. This is for the Greeks as well as Romans, the ancient meaning of tragedy, unavoidable catastrophe. And it is to Dido, especially, that we may apply the greatness of all Virgil's great line. These are the tears of things, and the stuff of our mortality cuts us to the heart. To Augustine, provincial Roman of African born, Dido was less exotic than she would have appeared to an Italian. She was in some respect an incarnation of Africa, and her catastrophe was Africa's catastrophe, sensuous Africa, whose great city of Carthage was Dido's city. And now, from this lascivious 17th century, Augustine's city, the city that boiled without without while Augustine boiled within. The famous sentence, "To Carthage I came," contains a purposeful rhyme, one of the first in Latin literature. The city's name Carthage rhymes with sartago, cauldron. This is an incantatory meant to draw our attention to the bubbling of the city and the bubbling of the boy, mechanism and microcosm and microcosm. In other words, macro and micro. A powerful and subtle rhetorical device, it would nevertheless have been excused by all earlier version as indecent, rustic, inappropriate. But unlike the Decini or Cineas, Augustine, the budding African Latinist who could identify so completely with Dido's passion, can allow his inner bubbling to surface from time to time in the form of African rhythm and rhetorical device. After his conversation and consecration as a bishop, hypo, Augustine will repeatedly delight his congregation by employing verbal pyrotechnics with an African swing. Bono dona, good gifts, will become one of his favorites. In this vernacularization of Latin, we may discern the first step towards the simplified, rhythming people's Latin of the Middle Ages. If Virgil was the great teacher of language and style, or grammar and rhetoric, to use the categories of the medieval school, Cicero was the great teacher of argument, or indisputable dialectic, to use the medieval term. As Virgil's Greek counterpart was, very roughly speaking, Homer to Cicero's Greek counterpart was Demosthenes. The two dialecticians had cast their shadows over the otherwise happy school days of countless studies of the Greek and Latin classics. The boy, C.S. Lewis, deliriously satisfied while basking in the high sun of Homer's war stories and in the soft afternoons of the discreetly erotic Catullus and the discreetly precise Tacitus, at last confronts the approaching gloom. The two great bores, Demosthenes and Cicero, could not be avoided. Homer and Virgil are art, and each was his age and place. What good movies are to ours, never a chore, always refreshingly, occasional, ennobling. Demosthenes and Cicero are hard work, and were studied in Augustine's day as paragons. Demosthenes and Cicero are hard work, and were studied in Augustine's day as paragons of the kind of thing that one might study today in journalism school if the Aeneid is language as metaphor, as the sacramental ritualization of human experience. Cicero's speeches are language as practical tool. A 2,000-year-old poem may still conceivably speak to us with as much force as it did to the people of its day. We would not expect the same from a 2,000-year-old newspaper editorial or 2,000-year-old advertising jingle, nor should we expect it from Cicero. Cicero, born in the century before Christ, exercised his techniques when Republican Rome in all its vigors welcomed public men. Augustine loved Cicero, as did the whole Latin world, which placed the Roman order just below Virgil on the divinity chart. Jerome, the contemptuous translator of the Latin Bible, awoke one night in a frenzied sweat. He had dreamed that Christ had condemned him to hell for being more a Ciceronian than a Christian. The ancients held the practical use of words in much higher regard than we do, probably because they were much more closer to the oral customs of prehistoric village life, so clearly reflected in Nestor's speech to the Greek chieftain on the Iliad, in the Mark Antony's speech over Julius Caesar's body, in which the fate of an entire race may hang on one man's words. But we are made uncomfortable and bored by Cicero's elaborating, coaching us in all the trickle of his trade, the many techniques for convincing others to act the way we want them to. For Cicero, to speak from the heart would be the rashest foolishness. One must always speak from calculation. What do I want to see happen here? What are the desire of my audience? How can I motivate him to do my will? How shall I distinguish my weakest arguments? How dazzle my listeners so they are no longer able to reason matters through independently? The techniques of the successful politician, the methods of modern advertising, the whole panoply of persuasion is to be found in Cicero. The figure closest to him in our own age might be Dale Carnegie, who advised that every single word and gesture he calculated to win an influence. However, squeamish such advice may make us to the ancient it made perfect sense. For an ancient to learning how to write a poem for one's own satisfaction, in addition to learning how to turn a phrase in a letter so as to please a friend. There was a larger literary task to be played out in the larger world. The polis, to which all educated men were bound to make their own contribution, to bring their positive influence to bear, and this world of politics required the arts of persuasion if one were to meet with success. You know, it's funny. There are some young politicians in America that are coming up and speaking in such a way that the comments people are making are, it's nice to hear someone who can actually utter a complete sentence. Those are the comments I see. It's nice to see a politician that actually can utter a complete sentence. That's how far we've fallen. In Augustine, it remains as vigorous as it has been in Cicero's day, and Augustine will spend his life using Cicero's elaborate and nuanced arsenal of techniques on behalf of a new worldview and new political agenda. This will be the public contribution of Augustine, the Roman citizen, to the dying Roman res publica. Besides the arts of rhetoric, persuasions, there was a third pursuit for the liberally educated man, a pursuit only a gifted speaker could successfully embark on, the way of philosophy. Beyond the literary art lies, however dimly perceived, the accent to truth, to wisdom. In Augustine's day, this accent was illuminated by the works of one great teacher, Plato, the Greek philosopher who had been Socrates' pupil, who was born in the time and place that all educated men looked to as the Golden Age, Athens in the 5th century BC. If the liberal arts were for the few, philosophy was for the fewer. Many liberally educated men did not even ascend to the goal of philosophy, because they did not think it would be possible to attain to truth or wisdom with any certitude. Cicero was such an agnostic after a long pursuit of philosophical truth, he found himself sliding with the skeptics who believed in the uncertainty of all ultimate knowledge, though he inclined in moral manners in the school of the Stoics, who believed with certitude that virtue will yield happiness. Cicero's even-tempered agnosticism will come as no surprise to anyone in our world who has noticed what a conventional philosophy it makes for Cicero's contemporary children, publicists, marketers, and all those who seek to motivate us to do what we might otherwise not think to do. As a philosopher, Cicero was the great package of his age, an unoriginal thinker with real flair, a sort of Will Durant, who could dramatize all the current and schools of thought so that anyone might understand them well enough to talk about them at a cocktail party. But Augustine wanted truth, not cheap success. Such a pressure cooker psyche can settle for nothing less. He soon abandoned the single emotional Catholicism of his mother and adopted something more exclusive and recherché, the religion of Mani, a Persian syncretist who had taken this and that from here and there and come up with something that can only strike us as California cult, a little Christian symbolism, a large dose of Zoroastrianism, dualism, and some of the quiet refinement of Buddhism. It was called Manichaeism. For a while, led Augustus off the hook. For one thing, it absorbed him from any responsibility for his raging lusts. In many systems, good was passive, unable to battle the gross and fleshy evils that raged against it. It was made to order religion for a smart young provincial who needed to explore every dark corner of the boiling city and experience every dark pleasure it had to offer. At the same time, think himself above the herd. But he couldn't keep up with Augustine's fearlessly inquiring mind. Like Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormonism, it was full of assertions but could yield no intellectual system to nourish a great intellect. We don't know what Augustine's read, but we know he devoured books. By his own admissions, he never learned Greek properly. Plato, however, was readily available in translation and packaged by commentaries of far greater profundity than Cicero. Plato was in the air Augustine braved, the figure a thoughtful young man must soon or later test himself against. Augustine, disappointed with Manichaeism and now appointed to his first big job as professor in rhetoric at Milan, forms a new and, of course, exclusive group, a temporary monastic community of like-minded young men who mean to ascend the truth with the aid of Plato and his Latin contemporaries. Their earnest intentions will eventually be dwarfed by their wives-to-be object to all this mopping about. And soon enough, Augustine's mother will arrive on the scene, creating, as she always does, emotional tornadoes and hurricanes, a sort of one-woman African storm, undrag. But the establishment, even for a short time, of such a community gives us an idea of how seriously and personally the pursuit of philosophy could be taken in the ancient world. Something far closer to an ashram than to a modern department of philosophy, and this community will provide Augustine with the seedbed he needs for his own philosophy to germinate. And that's exactly what happened during the hippie generation with the Americans, is the Americans were dropping acid, doing whatever, seeing shit that they couldn't explain. Their third eye blown fucking wide open. And suddenly it shifted consciousness to ask very deep question. And the only culture that could answer those esoteric questions was India. You know, and the Beatles go, and everyone's going to India. And the music, and the vibration of the music, because at this point, the music is at 4/4 hertz. And they're going back to India as musicians. Most of the musicians, the ones that were famous, that made like waves to India, which influenced many, many more hippies, women and men who went to India and into ashrams to learn Sanskrit, to study the intonations of chanting mantras. And at that point, the ancient instruments were still qualified probably at 432 hertz or other hertz that were better for a person's chakras. I'm saying all this because, in a sense, you have Augustine, who is going into the realm of, I'm going to fuck, I just want to fuck, I want to eat, I want to drink, I want to fucking get drunk, I want to do whatever. Because the philosophy is telling him, you can't, you're okay. Goodness is passive, not active. And something similar was happening with the hippies, in a sense. Free love, this, that. And the philosophy that they were getting answers that Catholicism, Protestant religion, evangelistic Christian baptism, whatever the fuck was going on, couldn't answer. To this day, they can't answer. If you ask any of these three Abrahamic religions, most of these, whatever you want to call them, leaders of religion, you ask them a question, right? They can't answer it. They'll come up with some bullshit answer. And you're sitting there knowing the answer, or you know someone who's giving you an answer to the same question you asked, and the fucking answer was brilliant, and it settled into your heart with truth. So philosophy, esoteric philosophy, could not be found in Western levels. It was India that had the answers from the Vedic scriptures. And that's my opinion. It doesn't mean I'm correct, but I'm throwing that out there. Okay, so let's continue. Socrates, at least in Plato's accounts of him, did not so much build a positive philosophy as pose questions that show up the utter foolishness of his interlocutor's assumption. He, of course, invented the Socratic method, forcing his students to start their quest for truth with a confession of their own ignorance. Plato, the product of this method, reasons with delicate skill towards the creation of a large and airy edifice, the grandest construct of ancient philosophy. Plato begins with his own experience of a spark of divinity in all creatures of the natural world, a spark he experiences particularly in himself and other human beings. In other words, the daemon of Socrates. But the spark is experienced within a world of corruption and death, the world of the flesh. It is worth our while to take a few moments to receive Plato in his own words, for they give us an idea both of the challenge confronting Augustine and of the flavor of the Augustinian ashram. Most of Plato is impenetrable on first reading. If it begins to give you a headache, skip to the end of the passage. Just take my word for it. Here is Plato in Phaedrus on the spark, the Daemon, the soul. Let's begin. Of the nature of the soul, psyche in Greek, though her true form be ever a theme of large and more than mortal discourse, let me speak briefly and in figure, and let the figure be composite, a pair of winged horses and a charioteer. Now the winged horses and the charioteers of the gods are all of them noble and of noble descent, but those of other races are mixed. The human charioteer drives his in a pair, and one of them is noble and of noble breed, and the other is ignoble, of ignoble breed. And the driving of them is necessity gives a great deal of trouble to him. I will endeavor to explain to you in what way the mortal differs from the immortal creatures. The soul in her totality has the case of inanimate being everywhere, and traverses the whole heaven in diverse forms appearing. When perfect and fully winged, she soars upward and orders the whole world, whereas the imperfect soul, losing her wings and dropping in her flight, at last settles on the solid ground, there finding a home. She receives earthly frame, which appears to be self-moved, but is reality moved by her power. And this composition of soul, body, is called a living and mortal creature. For a mortal, no such union can be reasonably believed to be, although fancy, not having seen nor surely known the nature of God, may imagine an immortal creature having both a body and also a soul, which are united throughout all time. Let that, however, be a God's will, and be spoken of acceptable to him. And now let us ask the reason why the soul loses her wings. The wing is the corporal element which is most akin to the divine, which by nature tends to soar aloft, carry that which gravitates downward into the upper region, which is the habitation of the gods. The divine is beauty, wisdom, and goodness, and the like. And by these, the wings of the soul is nourished and grows space. But when fed upon evil and foulness, and the opposite of good wastes and falls away, Zeus, the mighty Lord, holding the reins of a winged chariot, leads the way to heaven, ordering all and taking care of all, and there follows him the array of gods and demigods, marshaled in 11 bands. Hatia alone abides at home in the house of heavens. Of the rest, they who are reckoned among the princely 12 march in their appointed order. They see many blessed sights in the inner heavens, and there are many ways to and fro, along which the blessed gods are passing, everyone doing his work. He may follow who will and can, for jealousy has no place in the celestial choir. But when they go to banquet and festival, then they move up the steep to the top vault of heaven. The chariots of the gods, in even poise, obeying the reins, glide happily, but the other labor for the vicious and goes heavily, weighing down the charioteers to the earth when his steed has not been thoroughly trained. And this is the hour of agony and extremest conflict for the soul. For the immortals, when they are at the end of their course, go forth and stand upon the outside of heaven. And the revolution of the spheres carry them round, and they behold the things beyond, but of the heavens, which is above the heavens. What earthly poet ever will sing worthily? It is such as I will describe, for I must dare to speak the truth when truth is my theme. These abides the very being from which true knowledge is concerned, the colorless, formless, intangible essence, visibly only to mind, the pilot of the soul, the divine intelligence being nurtured upon mind and pure knowledge, and the intelligence of every soul which is capable of receiving the food proper to it, rejoices at beholding reality, and once more gazing upon truth is replenished and made glad until the revolution of the worlds bring their round again to the same place. In the revolution, she beholds justice and temperance and knowledge absolute, not in the form of generation or relations which men call existence, but acknowledge absolute in existence, absolute, and beholding the other true existence in like manner. And feasting upon them, she passes down in the interior of the heavens and returns home, and there the charioteer putting up his horse at the stall, gives them ambrosia to eat and nectar to drink. Such is the life of the gods, but of other souls, that which follow God best, and is likes to him, lifts the head of the charioteer into the outer world, and is carried round in the revolution, troubled indeed by the steads, and with difficulty beholding true being, while another only rises again, and sees again, and falls to see thy reason of the unruliness of the steeds. The rest of the souls are also longing after the upper world, and they all follow, but not being strong enough, they are carried around below the surface, plunging, treading unto one another, each striving to be the first. There is confusion and perspiration and the extremity of effort, and many of them are lamed or have their wings broken through the ill driving of the charioteers, and all of them offer a fruitless toil, not having attained to the mysteries of true being, go away, feed upon opinions. The reason why the soul exhibits this excessive eagerness to behold the plane of truth is that pasturage is found there, which is suited to the highest part of the soul, and the wing on which the soul soars is nourished with this. And there is a law of destiny that the soul which attains any vision of truth in company, which is God, is preserved from harm until the next period, and if attaining is always unharmed. But when she is unable to follow and falls to behold the truth, and through some ill hap sinks beneath the double load of forgetfulness and vice, and her wings fall from her, and she drops to the ground, then the law ordains that this soul shall at her first birth pass, not into any other animal, but only into man. And the soul which has, do you understand what he's talking about? He's talking about reincarnation and amnesia. This is Plato. I'm going to continue, and then I have to stop in a minute. Then the law ordains that this shall at her first birth pass, not into any other animal, but only into man. And the soul which has seen most of the truth shall come to the birth as a philosopher or artist of some musical and loving nature, that which he has seen the truth in the second degree shall be some righteous king or warrior, chief. The soul which is of the third class shall be a politician or economic or trader. The fourth shall be a lover of gymnastic, toils as a physician. The fifth shall lead to the life of a prophet or a hierophant. To the sixth, the character of a poet, and some other imitative artist will be assigned. To the seventh, the life of an artisan or husbandman. To the eighth, that of a sophist or a demagogue. To the ninth, that of a tyrant. All these states of probations in which he who does righteous improve, he who does unrighteously deteriorate his lot. Plato is the greatest of all Greek prose stylists, and through his tightly woven sentences run threads of delicate beauty and elusive grace. He doesn't sound like anyone else, and he convinces us not only of the largeness of his mind, but of the genuine mysticism of his spirit. He tells us from the start that is using metaphor, but we cannot help believe that he has glimpsed the world beyond the veil. Do you understand? He's the guy who told people about the splitting of the soul into two, which people talk about the twin flame. He's the guy that wrote about the Atlantis. He's the guy who wrote about the parable of the cave. So yes, he's a mystic. He's a mystic. I don't know if he took psilocybin. I'm not joking when I say that. I don't know why people think they weren't doing shit. They were doing shit. They were taking stuff. Because it is the right of any human being to take whatever the fuck they want. And do whatever they want. It is right now we live in a time when a woman's womb is not her own. In many, many, many countries. Both West and Third World. Her womb doesn't belong to her. Much less you can't do shit. with your own mysticism. He has at least as much in common with the wisdom of the East, with Buddhism and Taoism, as he does with the subsequent philosophy of the West. He is simply the great philosopher, and the difficulty one experiences in understanding him is not a difficulty based on superficial obfuscation, but on his genuine profundity. No one grasps Plato by reading him through quickly or once. So it was for Augustine, and thus the necessity of the ashram and stillness and philosophical companionship. Augustine's spirit resonates with the Pelagian chords of Plato, the restless, exiled soul looking everywhere for its true home, feasting on sewage while dimly remembering the nectar and ambrosia of high heaven. Plato is right, and are the most profound description in all the ancient world of the miraculous golden flashes of yearning embedded in the dross of reality. This out-of-jointness of the universe, who else, Augustine asks himself, even talks to these things? Hang on for a quick second. I've got to plug my phone in. I do want to finish this particular chapter, and if you want, I'll continue reading because I've done that before with books. But let me continue. So let me start from that because okay. Himself even talks of these things, and then the answers come to him. Saul of Tarsus, the wiry, bald-headed Jew, whose awkward, importunate letters signed Paul, the Christians have been using as scripture. For the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and they are contrary the one to the other, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would. The problem I have with Paul, as you all know if you follow me, is he was a he's the biggest misogynist, and I'm not into him. Surely this is meaningless. Coincidence. What could a sweaty little nobody dashing about the Mediterranean basin have in any common with the loftiest philosophy of all? And yet Augustine begins to read Paul seriously. He entertains the possibility that Plato even has something wrong, that the ancient truth is not a task the philosopher takes upon himself and succeeds at it by his own effort. Has the great Plato mistakenly equated knowledge with virtue? For if the flesh and the spirit are at war, isn't the human enterprise doomed to failure, even when joined by the most exalted philosophical types? Must Paul be closer to the mark when he says of preborn souls, the same souls Plato is describing in his metaphor of the charioteer, for whom God did foreknow, he also did a predestined to be conformed by the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestined, them be also called, of whom he called, them he also justified, and whom he justified, them he also glorified. In other words, if we mud-spattered human beings are ever to ascend the truth, we can only do it because God, a force ineffably greater than our war-torn selves, has predestined us and calls us upward. We will never make it under our own steam. And that, my friend, is a lie. Now, it's a lie. It's a lie because we were given free will. Free will is what the creator, whatever the universe, power, God, whatever the hell you want to call this force, gave us free will to fucking do what we needed to do to return to our original self when we were ready. And we get to do it. So this is more, again, I love this writer, and he's writing with the philosophy of Augustine, what Augustine is actually formulating in his own mind. He's clashing between Plato's great philosophy of self-responsibility and self-actualization with the Catholic Church emerging out of the, God knows where, emerging to create a sort of fascist state of we have the answers and you're fucked if you don't go our way. I'm just going to fucking simplify it that way because that's basically what it is and has been for 2,000 years. Having made this connection, Augustine falls apart. What he describes at this point in the Confessions is a full-scale emotional breakdown. No shit. Augustine has no one to talk to. A long time ago, I said the great Starseed tribes were gathering, and we are. We got each other to talk to. We can philosophize together. We can actually chew on the fat of rhetoric to seek truth, to spit out the fat and drink in the nectar of truth, our truth and the truth. And how do we know when truth is truth? When it's not subjective? We know it when a small handful or a larger handful of people all have the same downloads. That's how we know it's truth. That's how we know it's not subjective truth. It's an objective truth. When the experience is not just experienced by yourself, when the download, the aha moment, is experienced in pockets all around the world, and suddenly you realize, oh shit, you too? You also had this experience? Yes, that's when you know it's truth and not your truth. Having made this connection, Augustine falls apart. What he described at this point in the Confessions as a full-scale emotional breakdown. All over an idea? Yes. Augustine ideas do not float free. Abstracted from their human context, he personalizes everything, even the most rarefied philosophical utterances. Without education, he would have probably have been a self-destructive, provincial roustabout, always smoldering with one fire or another. With the discipline of his education, he is transformed into that unusual specimen, neither denatured academic nor effete upper-class connoisseur, but a man of feeling who takes ideas seriously, as with Tolstoy and Joyce, both educated wild men. The righteous blood of his homeland beats forever in his veins and animates his every thought. While talking with his fellow seeker, Alypius, he begins to weep uncontrollably. This mighty shower of tears, as he calls it, comes upon him out of nowhere from the secret bottom of my soul. Abashed, he runs from the house into the gardens. Throwing himself under a fig tree and giving full vent to my tears, he began to wail near nonsense for no reason he can understand. O thou, O Lord, how long, O Lord, will you stay angry forever? This is when philosophy clashes with religion. This is fear. This is fear howling for sense. From a house bordering the garden, he hears a child's voice chanting nonsense of its own. Tolly the gay, take read. Never having heard this children's song before, he decides it is a sign meant for him. He returns to the house and takes from the table where the stunned Alypius is still sitting the book he had been reading earlier, an edition of Paul's letters, in the time-honored fashion of the ancient world. He opens the book at random, intending to receive a divine message for the first sentence his eye should fall upon. The sentence he reads is, not in writing and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and in vain, but ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. Augustine is caught. He submits himself to the death of the flesh through baptism and to the Christian God. And this begins self-loathing and punishment. That's my take on it. You don't have to believe me, but that's what I see. The beginning of self-loathing and punishment. It's funny how we say, or they say, we're made in the image of God, with the lingam and the yoni and the pearl in a woman, the pearl within her and outside of her. In other words, we were given all of these sexual organs in the image of God, right? If we're to believe that, right? And in the image of God, not just in light, in the beautiful light that we are when we're out of these bodies, right? This electric energy that sparks. The spark, they call it. But we are always also put in bodies that give us sensual pleasures, and yet we beat it. And for 2,000 years, we did beat it. And we hated it. And there is a point to it that has wisdom. The only wisdom, to be honest, is the concept of fasting. And there is a war between the body wanting what it wants and the soul and the fast. A 3-day water fast. A 1-week water fast. And it is a battle. It's literally an exorcism. And there's something to that, and there's a wisdom to that for spiritual power. And it gives you a discipline that you cannot master in any other way except for pushing your body to lengths. But people have died doing that. You know, like decathlons. That's a sort of a fast of pleasure into pushing the body to its very limit. I mean, not everyone dies, but some people have, actually. So, let's continue. We have been using Augustine as a lens for viewing the classical world. What is about to be lost in the century of the barbarians' invasion is literature. The concept of classical civilization, had the destruction been complete, had every library been disassembled, every book burned, we might have lost Homer and Virgil and all classic poetry, Herodotus and Tacitus, and all the classical history, Demosthenes and Cicero, and all classical oratory, Plato and Aristotle, and all Greek philosophy, and Plotinus and Porphyry, and all the subsequent commentary. We would have lost the taste and smell of a whole civilization, 12 centuries of lyric beauty, aching tragedy, intellectual inquiry, scholarship, sophistry, and a love of wisdom, and the acme of ancient civilized discourse would have all been gone down the drain of history, all but a few lines of Sappho and much of the work of the Greek tragedians. And Archillas, Sophocles, and Euripides did go down that drain, and so very nearly lost the whole of Latin literature. We did lose, at any rate, the spirit of classical civilization. At certain epochs, wrote Kenneth Clark in Civilization, man has felt conscious of something about himself, body and spirit, which was outside the day-to-day struggle for existence and the night-to-night struggle with fear. And he has felt the need to develop these qualities of thought and feeling so that they might approach as nearly as possible to an ideal perfection. Reason, justice, physical beauty, all of them in equilibrium. He has managed to satisfy this need in various ways, through myths, through dance and song, through systems of philosophy, and through the order that he has imposed upon the visible world, the struggle of existence. Would fear now gain the ascendancy once more, and what remains of classical civilization will be henceforth found not in life, but between the covers of books. What is really lost when a civilization wearies and grows small is confidence, a confidence built on the orders and balance that leisure makes possible. Again, Clark, civilization requires a modicum of material prosperity, enough to provide a little leisure. But more, far more, it requires confidence. Confidence in the society in which one lives, beliefs in its philosophy, belief in its laws, and confidence in one's own mental powers. Vigor, energy, vitality, all the great civilization or civilizing epochs have had weight of energy behind them. People sometimes think that civilization consists in fine sensibilities and good conversation and all that. These can be among the agreeable results of civilization, but they are not what makes a civilization, and a society can have these amenities and yet be dead and rigid. When people work 3 jobs, you can't philosophize your own consciousness. You can't self-activate, self-realize. Whether insoluble political realities or inner spiritual sickness is more to blame for all the fall of classical civilization is finally beside the point. The life behind the works we have been studying, the passionate nobility of Virgil, the cool rationality of Cicero, the celestial meditativeness of Plato, this flame of civilization is about to be extinguished. The works themselves will miraculously escape destruction, but they will enter the new world of the Middle Age as things so strange they might as well have been left behind by interstellar aliens. One example will suffice to illustrate the strangeness of books to medieval men. The word grammar, the first step in the course of classical study that molded all educated men from Plato to Augustine, will be mispronounced by one barbarian tribe as glamour. In other words, whoever has grammar, whoever can read, possess magic inexplicable. So the living civilization died, to be reassembled and assessed by scholars of later age from the text preserved miraculously in the pages of its books. There is, however, one classical tradition that survived the transition, the still living tradition of Roman law. We have encountered Roman law already as a dead letter, promulgated by the emperor and circumvented first by the powerful, then increasingly by anyone who could get away with it. As the emperor's laws became weaker, the ceremony surrounding them becomes more baroque. In the last days, the Divine One's edict is written in gold on purple paper, received with covered hands in the fashion of a priest handling sacred vessels, held aloft for adoration by the assembled throng, who prostrate themselves before the law and then ignore it. But this picture alone would be misleading, just as we found earlier that the ancient had far greater respect than for practical public discourse. So they had far greater fear of chaos. Excuse me. The Britons, the Gauls, the Africans, the Slavs who long ago had flocked to the Roman standard, forsaking their petty tribal loyalties and becoming Roman citizens, gained greatly by exchanging tribal identity for the penumbra of citizenship. They won the protection of the Pax Romana and its predictability. With the decline of sudden and unexpected violence of all kinds, they could look forward in a way they had never been able to do before. They could plan, they could prosper, they could expect to live a normal lifespan. As Roman culture died out and was replaced by vibrant new barbarian growths, people forgot many things: how to read, how to think, how to build magnificently. But they remembered, and they mourned the lost peace. Call them the people of the Dark Ages, if you will, but do not underestimate the desires of these early medieval men and women for the rule of law. There was, moreover, one office that survived intact from the classical to the medieval polis, the office of Catholic bishop. In late antiquity, as municipal and provincial governments disintegrated and imperial appointees abandoned their posts, there was one official who could be counted on to stay with his people, even to death. The episkopos, say quickly, and you will hear where the English word bishop comes from. Episkopos, I don't know, I don't see it. In the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of Paul, bishops are mentioned occasionally as church functionaries, hardly distinguishable from priests from the Greek prebistereo, or elderly. Most early Christians' congregations seem to have been run by some combination of bishop and priest, local men. And in the first stages of development, women as well, who were chosen by the congregates for specified terms to take care of practical matters. With the deaths of the apostles, apostoli or envoys, who had been the chief conveyors of Jesus' message, the role of the bishops grew, and by the beginning of the 2nd century, we find him being treated in a more exalted manner, as a successor to the dead apostles and symbol of unity for the local congregation. But still, the appointee of his congregation, as its symbol of unity, he was duty-bound to consult his congregation in all important matters. From the beginning of my episcopate, the aristocratic Cyprian of Carthage, monument bishop of 3rd century Africa, confided to his clergy, I made my mind to do nothing on my own private opinion, without your advice and without the consent of the people. By the end of Augustine's life, such consultation was becoming the exception. Democracy depends on a well-informed electorate. And bishops could no longer rely on the opinion of their flocks. I'll leave it here. Thank you for listening. Sending you much love on your journey. Namaste.